the Early Head Start Rising Summer Learning Series. As promised, we have another great session of super interesting information from some just wonderfully generous people. I want to let you know a little bit about our presenters. I do want to say happy birthday, Head Start. We should all like a little, yay, we're 56 today and strong and proud. I don't know how many of you were able to join us for our party this morning at 11:30 Eastern Standard. We had Emmanuel Carter from Noggin on with us, and he was just a delight. The kids were all dancing. They had the classrooms on Zoom, and we got to watch so much fun, and it reminded me of site visits, which I missed terribly. So it was a lot of fun. But I hope you're doing something today to celebrate 56 years of an amazing program that's still going strong, often ahead of the curve in terms of care, education, comprehensive services. And that's a great intro for an Early Head Start Rising event, because back in '95, we know Head Start was really ahead of the game to say we need to make sure services are available for pregnant women, for infants, for toddlers. And we know the earlier we can intervene and provide support, the more progress kiddos make long-term, and certainly the families as well. I particularly have a place in my heart for pregnant women who find themselves in a tough situation, and how valuable Early Head Start is. And so part of what I've tried to do as I plan this series is to find folks who can start to better connect with Early Head Start, make sure that they know, especially in the health field, about who we are and what we can do, and then to bring some information to you related to specifically designed for Early Head Start. And so today we have two wonderful people from Vanderbilt University. Dr. Alacia Stainbrook and Dr. Evon Lee are here. They work they're faculty in pediatrics at Vanderbilt. They collaborate around autism specifically, and just do a lot of research and work with folks who are enrolled there as they prepare for professions in that field. And so they bring to us this really different perspective that they can share with you today as you think about your work in Early Head Start and how you can be just the best service to your families as possible. So without further delay, I'm going to turn the mic over to them. They have a wonderful presentation for you. I encourage you to put any questions in the chat. I will monitor that while we go along. We'll have plenty of time, I think, at the end for Q&A. And so please feel free to engage in that way. So without further delay, Dr. Stainbrook, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Lee, and I think I'm going to start, and then we'll go back and forth. We are so pleased and honored to be included today. You all are all on the front lines of taking care of children and families, and I think we have a lot of common passions that we share. My background is in developmental psychology, and Dr. Stainbrook's is in early childhood special education. So we come at it from a little bit different perspectives, but there's a lot of, I hope, good overlap. So next slide. So what we're hoping to do during our time together is spend part of the session on early identification, just kind of a general background and introduction to disabilities, but really focus on autism spectrum disorder in those very early years. We'll touch on a number of different things like how common it is, some of the risk factors, and then some of the early indicators, so signs that you all might pick up in the families that you see. And then the second half will be on early intervention, and Dr. Stainbrook will be talking about applied behavior analysis, some of the other approaches to early intervention. And one of the things that I think has just been wonderful as I've had a chance to get to know her better and work with the triad group, the autism group at Vanderbilt, is that there are an amazing number of resources that are online. Old as I am, I still get excited about free things. And there are some wonderful booklets and toolkits and videos and things that you might find interesting at some point to take a look at. Next slide. So just in terms of a global context, as we talk about disability, it's just part of being human. Almost all of us will at some point in our life experience either temporarily or permanently having some type of disability. And if you look at it across the globe, there are more than 1 billion people who live with some form of disability at any one point in time. And the vast majority live in developing countries. And I think that that's from one of the important parts about that is just that they probably have fewer social and medical and educational resources to help them cope with the disabilities. Next. So disability, just in the broadest sense, can be defined as anyone who has some degree of functional limitation. When you look at these pictures, the little girl on the bottom left has a hearing impairment. The person seated has mobility needs and is using a wheelchair to get around. But the current estimates are that about 20%, 1 out of 5 of all Americans, has some degree of disability. Next slide. So when we kind of move down a little bit lower on the lifespan and think about developmental disabilities, these are typically chronic conditions that are due to an impairment in physical, cognitive, speech language, psychological, or self-care areas, and they usually occur before 21 years of age. Rather than the 20% we were just looking at across the lifespan, about 1 in 6 or 17% of children between 3 and 17 will have one or more developmental disabilities. And we talk about them as developmental because they occur early in life. They typically impact day-to-day functioning, and they usually last throughout a person's lifetime, but that doesn't mean that they can't show improvements, learn new things, compensate in a lot of areas for the difficulty. But you know, if you are born with a hearing impairment, most likely that will stick with you, but there may be hearing aids, cochlear implants, other ways to help one deal with that particular challenge. Next slide. So I think all of us who work in this field use developmental milestones as one of the ways to just kind of gauge, are things coming along as expected, or are there some issues that might be going on that we need to pay attention to? So, you know, we learn those milestones of rolling over, developing a social smile, reaching, sitting, feeding ourselves, all those sorts of things. And I think those are probably the milestones that you all see in the work that you do, kind of help you know whether things are coming along typically, or maybe there's an area that you want to pay closer attention to. And as a developmental psychologist, those have always been important in terms of knowing the milestones, knowing what to look at that might appear to be of concern, but it's also helpful to have standardized tools and other assessments to use to just kind of put things together to see, is this something that's just temporary, the child's going to grow out of it, or is this something that we need to pay a little bit closer attention to and maybe start some intervention. Next slide. So I come from sort of a bit of a medical background. I worked in an outpatient clinic in pediatrics for about 24 years, but there's also a really important legal and educational side that many of you are probably more familiar with than I am. But I'm always struck by the fact that it wasn't until 1975 that our country had a law in place, the Education of All Handicapped Children, that guaranteed a free and appropriate education for children. But the 1975 law really focused on school-age children, and it wasn't until about 10 years later, in 1986, that an amendment was passed that really funded the assessment of and intervention with children from birth to 3. So shifting that age range down more to the age range that early Head Start focuses upon. And as most of you know well, it identified 5 different major areas of development to look at for this population. Next slide. If we were all together in one room, I would be asking you to sort of throw out what are the 5 areas of development, but that gets a little cumbersome with a big group. So as you know, cognitive or problem-solving skills is one area. physical development, and that includes both the gross motor and the fine motor skills, as well as vision and hearing, sensory impairments, communication, social, which can include the emotional development, sort of self-regulation, all those kinds of important skills, and then adaptive or self-help skills. Next slide. It's interesting to me that every single state has a little bit different criteria in terms of determining eligibility for early intervention or those Part C services for the birth to 3 population. I know some states call it first steps, some have other kinds of names. We go very concretely in Tennessee. It's just Tennessee's early intervention system. It's very basic, but the ways that you qualify for early intervention in Tennessee are either looking at a developmental delay. So in Tennessee, that means you have to have 2 areas of 25% delay or 1 area of 40% delay in those 5 areas that we were just talking about. So if you have a 24-month-old and they're functioning at an 18-month level in a couple of areas, that would be a 25% delay. At 24 months, a 40% delay would be around 14.5 months. And then the other area that qualifies a child for early intervention in Tennessee is having a specific diagnosis or condition that's associated with significant delays. So you might be born with a genetic condition like Down syndrome, or you might have spina bifida or other kinds of things that you sort of know on the front end will be associated with some developmental challenges. And so you don't have to wait until things show up as a delay to go ahead and receive service coordination and other sorts of intervention. But depending on what state you're in, and it was so fun to watch things pop up from Oregon to Florida, you all are represented coast to coast today. You all will know better what your particular criteria are. Next slide. So there are some disabilities that really do show up very early in life, and then others that will show up later in childhood. So you can imagine we don't diagnose learning disabilities in the birth to 3 population because we just don't expect little children to have a lot of academic skills. And so if we're not expecting reading and writing in those particular areas, we wouldn't be making that kind of determination. But some of the things that do show up really early in life, especially now that most hospitals do newborn hearing screening, that we can pick up hearing impairments pretty early in life. Visual impairments also can be detected by physicians, nurse practitioners who see the babies early on. Cerebral palsy is often diagnosed between 1 and 2 years of age as the pediatricians and other healthcare providers look at muscle tone and reflexes and other areas that may show impairments. And I don't know if you all are seeing the little black boxes appearing, but I'm not sure. That's great, thank you. And then we can have developmental delays in all those different areas that we looked at, speech language impairments. And for children on the autism spectrum, it's really common for either speech language impairments to be the first thing that people notice, or hearing impairments. While children on the autism spectrum typically have normal hearing, there may be the fact that they may be not responsive to certain kinds of social interactions or input may raise concerns that there's a hearing loss there. So during the rest of our time together, we're going to concentrate a little bit more on autism spectrum disorder specifically, and then some of the interventions and things that might be helpful. Next slide. So this is just to help us transition to talking about ASD, or we'll just shorten it to autism today. The last 20 years or so, there's been tremendous interest in research in terms of babies with autism, and also a lot of focus on siblings of children with autism as a group that's at increased risk. And so it's been a very important group to study. Next slide. So I like this definition. It came from a book that's about 20 years old now called Educating Children with Autism. But in one sentence, I think it really captures kind of the essence of what our concerns are in this area. So it's defined as something present from birth or very early in development that affects essential human behaviors such as social interaction, the ability to communicate ideas and feelings, imagination, and the establishment of relationships with others. And I love this picture because this little girl is about 6 months old, but you can see she's almost willing you to smile at her. You know, she is looking right at the person taking the picture, making little sounds, just engaging in that just to and fro, that back and forth interaction, and really connecting with the person that she's trying to reach out to. Next slide. Just in terms of some general introductory facts about autism, the latest data show that autism is now occurring in 1 in 54 births in the US. It's over 4 times more common among boys than girls. Around a third, and this number has changed over time, but are estimated to have an intellectual disability in addition to autism. There are no racial, ethnic, or cultural or socioeconomic boundaries, just meaning there's no group that is excluded from the risk of having an autism spectrum disorder. Minority groups are often diagnosed later and less often. In this latest round of data that has come out, African American and white children have been identified pretty similarly, but Hispanic children seem to be diagnosed less often and later. So I think it's more of an issue of access to the evaluations and services than it being less frequent in certain groups. And then the costs are just exorbitant. The costs of caring for Americans with ASD in the US in 2015 were estimated at $268 billion. And for a lot of these facts, if you want to do more reading or get more information about it, the Center for Disease Control website, which of course this last year many of us have looked at because of the pandemic, and also Autism Speaks has a lot of really good information that's very accessible. Next slide. So if you can see from this graph, the numbers just show that the prevalence of autism, as it's been measured since 2004, has steadily increased over time. Next slide. And I think a lot of times when we're talking to different groups, questions always come up about, well, where do these numbers come from? And is this increase really real? So next slide. So just for one quick digression, the numbers actually come from a monitoring network that is part of the CDC called the Autism Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network, or ADDM. And it's a collaborative network that involves about 11 states in the country where they use the same approach to identifying children with autism. They usually base these numbers on 8-year-olds. And I think the thinking behind that was by the time you're 8, and you're going to receive a diagnosis of autism, it's frequently identified by then. If they move it much younger, then it could be that children who aren't identified until they get into school would be missed. And then the CDC hopes that this information will be used by local communities as they plan what services are needed. They see kind of what resources would be helpful for their community. Next slide. And the states that are in the 2 shades of purple are the states that are used to come up with these particular prevalence numbers. Next slide. So I think it's really hard to give a yes or no answer to this question about is the prevalence increase real? What we do know is that more children with ASD are being identified. And as you probably know from many of the public awareness advertisements and initiatives, there is greater awareness both among professionals, but also among lay communities about autism. I know it's embarrassing to say, but I started doing this about 40 years ago, and it was very common for families to come to the clinic and never have heard the word autism. But now it's something that I think most people have heard about and know a little bit about. There's clearly an increased emphasis on early identification. Diagnostic criteria have changed over time, and there's a higher prevalence of risk factors. And we'll talk both about both of those last 2 points a little bit more in just a moment. Next slide. It may be because of my age, but I always like to just stick in a historical perspective slide. And I think this is interesting because in the big scheme of things, autism is really a relatively recent diagnosis. The word autism comes from the Greek autos, meaning self. And I think a lot of us think about autism as involving that more of an inward turning, a more focus on one's own self and needs and interests, as opposed to interacting and reaching out to others. The first time it was actually identified and named was back in 1943 when Dr. Leo Kanner, who was an Austrian-American psychiatrist, had seen a bunch of children in his practice and then wrote an article on 11 of the children that seemed to share a lot of common characteristics. And he described them as having autistic disturbances of affective contact. And just ironically, a year later, Dr. Hans Asperger, who was an Austrian pediatrician, published a pretty similar article about children who had a lot in common with Dr. Connors, but had a little bit higher verbal and cognitive skills. But it was written in German and not translated into English until 1991. So people really didn't know about the commonalities there for a long time. Next slide. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but a lot of you probably know that psychologists and psychiatrists and neurologists and developmental behavioral pediatricians frequently use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders as kind of the book that defines lots of different developmental disabilities and also mental conditions. And the first time that it was published was back in 1952. And in 1952, in the first edition and the second edition, what we consider autism today was just kind of discussed under the heading of childhood schizophrenia. So autism wasn't even in those particular manuals. In 1980, it came in for the first time, and there was a reference to infantile autism. And then over the next few editions, the terminology changed again. And so the one that we're using now is the one we'll talk about a little bit today. But in 2013, the fifth edition came out, and they talked about autism spectrum disorder rather than dividing it up into a lot of different categories, like a number you probably remember, the PDD and OS, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, and Asperger's disorder. They all kind of got combined under this umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. Next slide. So I think one of the most important points here is just to make the point that ASD is a behavioral diagnosis. This may change in the future, but right now there's not a blood test or an MRI or a CAT scan or a genetic test that we can do that would definitively make the diagnosis. It really is based on the kinds of behaviors that we get to see in the parents' report, the teacher's report. So just knowing that at this point, because it is based on behaviors, there's always room for error, but this is a way of at least trying to capture what the commonalities are in this particular condition. So in terms of the current criteria, they've collapsed the three domains from before into two, and there are deficits in social communication, and then the second area is restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. And I'll talk about what that means in just a second. Next slide, please. So the way this is defined in the DSM-5 in terms of deficits in social communication, they require that the child or adult show all three of these criteria. And so for deficits in social emotional reciprocity, that's that kind of give and take of social interaction. We use that a lot when we're conversing with other people, that back and forth. Deficits in nonverbal communication, which include gestures and how we pair our gestures with how we're speaking, and then deficits in developing and maintaining relationships. And the way these are worded, I think, sound like they're more appropriate for a little bit older people, but if you'll go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how this is going to look in terms of younger children. So some of the social differences that you might see are less sustained eye contact. It's not that eye contact is absent, but they might not sort of maintain eye contact with an adult or caregiver as long as expected. There might be reduced reactions to facial expressions. They may not point to objects or interesting things to get their caregivers to look at them, and may not follow their caregiver's point in looking at something of interest to the adult. Less likely to show concern or empathy, and then as they get a little bit older, having difficulty making friends. Next slide. In terms of communication differences, the kinds of things that you would anticipate, this time rather than the pointing to direct attention or show social interest, they're also less likely to point to request. You may see those delays in language use, so no single words by 15 months or two-word combinations by 24. It's really common for parents to report that they don't turn when their name is called, even when it's been clearly established that they have normal hearing. You may see that repeating or echoing, mixing up of pronouns. So rather than saying, I want a cookie, they might say, you want a cookie. The sustaining conversation, I think we kind of touched on, and that difficulty in pretend play. I think it's somewhat ironic or paradoxical that you do hear parents at times report on what a wonderful memory their 2 or 3-year-old has, where they know all the letters of the alphabet, can count really high, know all the shape names, but then having a simple conversation or that kind of sharing of things that are interesting with them and asking about other people's interests may be lacking. And then you also sometimes hear about that loss of language or social milestones, which often happens around the 15 to 24 months. Next slide. In terms of that second area, you just have to show 2 out of 4 of these particular areas. So the stereotyped or repetitive movements, verbal behavior or use of objects, adherence to routines and ritualized behavior. So some children just insist on following the same route to grandmother's house, or they have a lot of difficulty transitioning from the play activities to the dinner table. And it doesn't mean that there are going to be some children who have those individual difficulties in behavior, but it's that kind of combination of all these things together that raises concerns about autism. And then the fixated interests and the hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input. And I'll describe that better in just a second. Next slide. In terms of these behavioral differences, some of the things that I think would catch our attention are some of the repetitive behaviors, like rocking or spinning or walking on their tiptoes, hand flapping, those kinds of things. We mentioned the difficulty with transitions. There may be more of an emphasis on repetitive use of parts of objects rather than pushing a car back and forth and taking turns and then making the car noises. They might get focused on spinning the wheels. They may have a really high pain tolerance, not react to things that would typically hurt other children. And then in the DSM-5, they kind of put back in the concerns about sensory differences, which were not in the criteria in the DSM-4. So they might be overly or under sensitive to smells or sounds or sights or touches. And they may show sometimes an unusual use of vision or gaze, where they hold up things and look at it from the corner of their eyes. Next slide. There are lots of really good initiatives online. The Learn the Signs Act Early is a good one to look at. And next slide. There are a lot of professional organizations that recommend monitoring and screening. The current Academy of Pediatrics recommendations suggest that at every visit, there's some kind of routine surveillance where the pediatrician or the nurse practitioner or healthcare provider just says, do you have any concerns? Kind of asks about developmental milestones, gets a sense of how things are going. But then at 9, 18, and 30, there's a recommendation that a formal screening tool be used. And you all probably have your favorites and ones that you use routinely. Ages and stages, those kinds of tools would be interesting, would be helpful because they look at multiple areas of development. But they do recommend a specific tool at 18 and 24 months in terms of looking specifically at autism type concerns. Next slide. I'm going to go kind of quickly through the next part because I want to be sure that Dr. Stainbrook has plenty of time. But there are lots of different autism screening tools. One's called the MChat. I think a lot of pediatrician offices use it. It's for 16 to 30 months. And the important part about this is there's about 20 questions the parents complete it. It's kind of a yes/no format. And it's for a general population. So you don't have to have concerns that this child has autism. This is just a general screening to check into it. And then the STAT, the screening tool for autism in toddlers, is more for a clinician-directed, probably 20-minute interaction where there are autism concerns, because it's going to take somebody who's had the training on the tool, is reliable with it. Next slide. I think this is the most important point. The screening just gives you some information about whether this child is at an increased risk or not for autism. And if they are, then you refer for further assessment. So the screening is not going to provide a diagnosis. And I think that's really important for parents to understand, because it can be so scary to hear, okay, you know, we have some worries about this. We want to get it checked out further. But just to make it clear, we're just trying to be thorough and careful, see if there are any areas that you know, we can provide some support that will be helpful in. Next slide. And we're going to talk just a second about assessment. Next. Because I'm a psychologist, I thought I will give you this example, but this would relate to multiple specialties who do these kinds of assessments. So I mentioned this just to say, I think sometimes parents will go through an assessment, will get a diagnosis, and they'll think, how can they make this determination? They just saw my child for a couple of hours. And I think it's important to know that it's usually more than that face-to-face time where a decision is made. So hopefully there's a review of all the past history, the previous evaluations like OT or speech language that have been done, a chance to see the child's behavior, a cognitive assessment, social adaptive assessment, usually behavior rating scales. And then there are some autism specific measures that are often really helpful. Next slide. Lots of different options for the general development. Bailey, Battelle, Developmental Profile, and Mullen are options, but the kinds of tasks that they use really do overlap, and they're all put together very well. Next slide. So one that you all may see in reports and may see psychologists and other folks do is called the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. Next slide. And it's actually a pretty fun thing to give, but it gives you a lot of really good information because you present a lot of different play situations and then watch how the child responds. Do they share interests? Do they use words? Do they use gestures? A lot of different things. So the examiner might blow bubbles and then see if the child directs attention to their parents or says more or comments, or just sort of how they approach this in a lot of other situations. So they call them social presses, but it's kind of an opportunity for the child to demonstrate their skills in a lot of areas. Next slide. So this is a complicated picture, but the point is we have these core symptoms that are in those two middle overlapping balls. And then there are all these other things that may go along with autism. Next slide. And for the birth to 3 population, some of the things that you all will see that happen really commonly, they're not a core feature of autism, but they often go along with it. So lots of children with sleep difficulties, feeding problems, including being really picky eaters, which may go along with some of those sensory differences, gastrointestinal disorders, like constipation is a really big issue for a lot of children on the spectrum. Seizures, obesity, anxiety, aggression, and hyperactivity are very common. Next slide. Some of the risk factors for ASD, we talked about having a sibling with autism. We've also found out in recent years having older parents, certain genetic conditions like Down syndrome, Fragile X, and Rett syndrome, and being very preterm are also risk factors. Next slide. And in terms of younger siblings, about 10 years ago, there was a really thorough article that came out that showed that the risk of, if you have a child on the autism spectrum, the risk of having another child is almost 20%. So it's really high. And if you are working with families and that's an area of concern, it's important to talk with their doctor, maybe even talk with a genetic counselor, just so folks understand what the subsequent risk is as they're trying to make informed decisions. Next slide. And just go ahead and we'll just slip to the next slide. The point there was just that, as you can imagine, it's incredibly hard to get this kind of news. And then one of the things that's hopeful is we know that having evidence-based interventions can improve outcomes. So with that, we'll transition to Dr. Stainbrook, and she has some, I think, wonderful information to share.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I hope you guys can all hear me okay. I can't see anybody's videos. I can't see your beautiful faces. I can only see my screen. So feel free to nudge me if something's not working well. I don't have to tell this group how important early intervention is. That's why you guys are all here today. That's why you're doing what you do. My hat at Triad and at Vanderbilt is very much in this world of, let's help families access early identification services, but then let's also make sure that we can help them access their next steps, right? So families come in and they have been in search of answers. They've been waiting on a lengthy wait list, quite possibly, for this autism evaluation. And regardless of the outcome of that, whether they receive a diagnosis or not, the next question is frequently, now what? What do I do? And so I want to talk a little bit about early intervention for young children with autism, and a little bit about what that should look like, and then share some resources with you all. So I would guess that even if you're not super familiar with what it is, you've probably heard the term applied behavior analysis, and that is going to be the therapy that we see most frequently recommended for children with autism. What that is a therapy based on the science of learning and behavior. So this idea that all behavior is learned, and we learn through interactions with our environment, right? Not rocket science for us. We see that happening every day. One of the misconceptions frequently is that we recommend ABA, we use ABA for decreasing challenging behaviors. And that is absolutely the case, but it's also the case that it's very much used to increase behaviors we want to see more of, to teach children. And it's not just for individuals with autism. And so that is another misconception. It absolutely is a therapy recommended for children with autism because of the way we break down the skills and we think about what I'll call antecedents and consequences, and talk about here in a little bit. But the strategies, for a lot of us, we think of as good teaching. This is, what we're using in our classrooms in some ways. It's what we're using with children with a variety of developmental delays and disabilities, maybe sometimes even with our spouses or friends or other people in our lives. So the key strategies, I could spend all day talking about what is ABA, and it really is this broad umbrella of intervention approaches. And I'm certainly happy to communicate with y'all more about that after today's presentation if you have questions. But two of the strategies I really want to highlight that you are likely using frequently with the students or children in your lives are positive reinforcement. So this idea that we want to make sure we are providing feedback, specific positive feedback for those things that we see children doing well, that we want them to do more of. And then this really big idea, this kind of overarching idea in ABA of antecedents and consequences. So behaviors don't happen in isolation, right? There's typically something, an antecedent that sets up the occasion for that behavior. And then there's a consequence to that behavior that kind of informs whether or not we might see that behavior again. So I cue you to put on your shoes and socks because it's time to go in the car. You get in the car, do as you've been asked to do, and then we go out for ice cream. right? Next time I'm saying, hey, get on your shoes and socks. If I have that memory or that experience of something good happening when I engaged in that behavior, I might be more likely to engage in that behavior again. Same idea if it's maybe a problematic behavior. Maybe you know, I asked you to put on your shoes and socks because it was time to go to the grocery store. You threw your shoes and socks at me. I decided I can't deal with this today. We abandoned the trip to the grocery store. So next time I might use that same behavior to get the results that I'm looking for. So again, this idea that behavior is learned and we're learning it through those interactions in our environment. And the good news about that as it applies to ABA is that we can manipulate those antecedents and consequences to set the occasion for skills, behaviors that we want to see for our children. So if you have a student or a child that has been seen for an autism evaluation, likely there will be a recommendation for applied behavior analysis. And I think what's important for our conversation today is thinking, what does that look like for young children? I have been in this field for about 25 years at this point, and I have certainly seen grades of ABA that are more or less appropriate for young children, right? So we probably don't want to put a 2-year-old child in a room with one therapist sitting at a table for hours at a time doing flashcards. And that might sound like an extreme example, but we've been there as behavior analysts. That's one of my backgrounds. And we've been there and had to really think about what does this look like for young children. And so we want to make sure it's individualized to meet the needs and the goals of the specific child that we're working with. And there should be an assessment component to figure out where are the gaps and where are the priorities for this child. It's not a one-size-fits-all curriculum. We want to make sure it's developmentally appropriate, right? We're not putting toddlers at tables for hours on end, but that we're keeping things play-based and fun and in the natural environment to the extent possible. I want to make sure that it's inclusive of the primary caregivers. So if you are familiar with ABA, or you might see it in a report that's brought to you from a psychologist or medical provider, you might see a recommendation that says something along the lines of 10 to 20 plus hours a week of applied behavior analysis therapy is recommended. And that works really well for some families when they can access it. It certainly can be beneficial for a lot of our children, but it's less beneficial if our caregivers aren't involved in that therapy and aren't learning the same strategies to support their child at home. And so that's a big one for me. I want to make sure that's a component. It's data driven. And so if we're going to invest all this time and energy and then this child's time and energy in these therapies, we want to make sure that we're taking data to see how they're responding and making adjustments when response rates are slowing down, and then continuing on the same path when things are looking good. And then I also want to highlight that it can be used in a group setting. So I'm going to show you a video example here in a moment of a caregiver working with a child using strategies in ABA. And I want you to know that that is a way that it is delivered frequently, is one-on-one, but it can also be delivered in a group setting, in that classroom setting, in the daycare or childcare setting too, just by setting aside some time to have that one-on-one bid for communication or play or imitation, and then providing that feedback. And we'll share some examples here in a moment. Okay, so what does it actually look like? So I want to share a video. In some ways, I'm very much oversimplifying what is ABA, but what I want to do is make it accessible and help folks to see that, you know, a lot of these things are strategies that we're using, and that the important thing to keep in mind is that, you know, we have that positive reinforcement piece, we have these ideas of antecedents and consequences, and that's especially for our young kiddos, we're keeping it fun and in that natural environment. Hopefully I did everything right and you guys will be able to hear my audio. Please let me know if you can't. Joshua, look what I have. You are gonna like this. I am 100% sure. Ready, set, stop.
Oh, he's gonna try it.
He'll try. That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you need help? Help.
Lisa can help. Putting on, turn, 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 ready, set, go! Look! Stop. Oh, help. Good job. I will help.
Okay, so the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving on. So we can see, remembering back to what Dr. Lee shared with us earlier in some of these core deficits that we see in autism, we see a child who is enjoying this top, enjoys playing with it, but doesn't quite have those social communication skills to say, I want to do this again, help me, let's do it another time. And so when we think about how are we going to use this idea of antecedents, behaviors, and consequences to teach a new skill, and the skill being communication, telling me that you want more of this. Some of the basic kind of antecedent manipulation strategies that Lisa's using, my colleague in this video, is just starting with a fun activity, setting up an opportunity where there is a need for communication. I'm having fun with this. I want to do it again. I actually can't do it without you. I'm going to need you. Modeling those communication skills and then providing a lot of prompting to see if we can get what we're looking for. And by the end, you do see him, first he's just wanting a little bit of eye gaze, right? And then move us forward a little bit further and he's actually handing her the toy. And these are all steps in the right direction for developing those social communication skills. And the consequence strategies she used to make sure that he understands, like, that was good. That's what I want you to do. That's what I'm looking for, which is activating the toy, right? That natural consequence of, this is what you want, so now I'm going to give it to you. You did a great job asking for that, using a lot of positive affect, and then, of course, providing verbal praise. So, when I think about ABA therapy for our little ones, I think it's a great therapy for our little ones to start with, but I also think that there are priority areas to focus on for intervention. And I highlight this because, especially for those of us who are working with caregivers and trying to give our caregivers tools and strategies to work with at home, it could be really overwhelming. You might get this report that highlights a number of deficit areas for your child, and where do I possibly begin? And so for our young ones with autism or at risk for autism, I think a lot about social communication, that core deficit we talked about, because that opens up the window or the opportunity for so much additional learning, right? So how can I effectively communicate with others to meet my wants and needs? And being able to think about communication flexibly and not just verbal communication or sign language or even pictures, but, let's make sure we haven't missed some of those universal tools, just eye gaze and gestures, like giving something to someone to say, I need help with it, or pointing to something. And then also engagement. And so, one of the reasons that we see recommendations for such high numbers of ABA therapy for young children and older children with autism is that we want them engaged. We want them actively engaged in meaningful ways. Given some of those deficits in social communication, given some of the rigidity, we're at risk for those kids missing out on a lot of engagement opportunities. And so we want to make sure we're creating a lot of room for that and actively trying to engage our kiddos in these meaningful activities so that there is opportunity to learn through imitation and modeling and practice. So I won't go into a ton of detail on this part, but just to highlight again that, social communication is such an important part of a child's development, and learning to use words effectively, but other ways to deliver a message too. One of the things we see a lot in our young children with autism is this tendency to use another person as a tool. So I need something, I know I can't get it myself, I'm just going to grab you by the hand and kind of blindly take you to what it is, not really making that social connection that I'm communicating with you for a specific outcome, and making sure we're creating opportunities for that. To kind of facilitate this information sharing piece, one of the things that we wanted to share with you all today are some of the resources that we've developed to kind of have these bite-sized chunks of information for caregivers or service providers. So I'd be happy to share this PowerPoint with Dr. Bergeron if that's helpful to disseminate so that you have these links. But we have a short Vimeo video that just kind of walks caregivers or providers through how do I set up these opportunities for communication and demonstrates what that looks like. And along with that, it's just a 2-page tip sheet on how I can do that at home or in the classroom. Similarly, we have the same thing established around engagement. And so how can I be a fun play partner, right? A lot of us, we've forgotten how to play. And so how can I be fun and engaging and encourage my child to want to interact with me and to then sustain that interaction so that some really great learning can take place and those opportunities can be there. And so there will be another video there. And then just a couple more resources for you. We have a number of tip sheets similar to the ones that I just highlighted on the slide prior to this one. And then also some resources related to what to do after a first-time diagnosis or what to expect autism to look like or the service provision to be like for a child that's preschool age versus school age. Also tools around healthy bodies for our adolescents. So a number of great resources there. And then the last resource that I'll share is our basic online training modules. And so the videos that I highlighted previously with those links are just really short 2-minute videos to give you information on a very specific strategy. That's the teaser to get to these curriculum modules where we have information for caregivers, service providers, other individuals related to some of these bigger concerns for children with autism. So challenging behavior, sleep, toilet training, communication, social play skills, and then even that transition from Part C to Part B services and how to prepare caregivers and children for that. These are all free. They just require registration on our learning platform. And then individuals can work through the courses at their own pace. Each curriculum has about 6 to 8 modules, and each module takes about 10 to 15 minutes to complete. So really easy to pace through on your own time. We definitely wanted to leave time for questions, and we have about 5 minutes. So do reach out if you have specific questions for either myself or Dr. Lee. We'd be happy to chat with you. We have a number of other resources and training opportunities, but I do want to make sure if there are any burning questions, we have just a couple minutes for those.
So I think there were a couple in the chat. The biggest was, can we get this PowerPoint? So you answered that one, which is great. I'll share that with you all, but we're also recording this. So for those of you who might want to use this for your staff, you can link back to this conversation. That was chock full of information. What a great, just so helpful. One of the questions that was in the chat that I think is worth asking, and for those of you in the audience, I'm just going to put a survey in the chat. Please take it before you log off, just so that I know if these are helping you. I want to make these sessions as helpful as possible. So please do that. While you're going and grabbing that link though, one of the questions was, how do you support parents through the process of maybe having to have such a tough conversation when they think it's their fault and they think they've done something wrong? I think that's a good general question, since we only have time for one, that folks would really appreciate hearing from you about.
Dr. Lee, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I think one of the most important things is having a very sensitive provider who is giving this information. And I know in the past we tried, and the pediatricians that we worked with, to really specifically address that and just say, this is not something you did wrong. This is not something you could have done differently. What we need to do is just kind of start where we are now and try to figure out what supports can we put in place, what can we do to try to help your child in the areas that they need assistance, and also to help your family so that you all are having a good quality of life, that you're enjoying each other and able to interact. But that's, I think, a huge question, because I think especially moms just tend to put so much on themselves and to think, if I had eaten something different in pregnancy, if I had, not had that one drink, if there, whatever it is. And so just trying to help put some of the guilt aside and free up a little energy for, for the areas that we can do something helpful about.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I also love to be able to, and it's always easy to do, but identify a strength that I'm seeing, something that caregiver has already demonstrated doing such a wonderful job with, just taking the initiative to bring their child in, and things that we noted during the observation. I think it's the more positive feedback we can give to caregivers to kind of rewrite that narrative of, let's not talk about those and let's think about what you're doing that's so great and so strong and so helpful for your child right now.
That's great advice. That is, and that's really the hardest part, I think, especially with the younger children who, some of this is, like you said, the assessments are not going to identify per se. They're just going to give you some direction as to whether to do something more formal, or the screenings rather. But what a fantastic presentation. I can't thank you enough. This is the kind of information I think is so valuable for folks who are doing this hard work every day. I want to thank everybody who showed up today. My link is not working for the survey. I just got a private message, so I'll try to email it to you. I do like making sure that you're getting something out of these. And just as some foreshadowing, we have our next early Head Start Rising series in a couple weeks on executive functioning. But the one after that on June 15th is actually about early identification of speech and language. So somewhat connected here. And gesture is the big focus of this particular professor's research. So it's really exciting to put all these pieces together over these six series topics. So hopefully I'll see all of you back. Tell your friends. We have plenty of room for everybody. And thank you again to both of you for taking time out of your busy schedule. We really appreciate it. I hope we can link back together and do some more partnership and collaboration. I'd really love it.
Sounds
That'd be great.
great.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Bye-bye.